Hello, my dear friends. They wore silk, danced under gaslight, and powdered their faces to perfection. Yet under those glamorous Parisian gowns, something was rotting. Behind every perfume bottle and lacy glove hid a secret the city never spoke of. No one warned you how dangerous lace underwear could be. No one dared whisper what infections festered beneath corsets. Why did so many Parisian women die silently from mystery illnesses? Tonight, we'll peel back the satin and step into the hidden hygiene horrors of 1920s Paris. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one imagines the daily life of women in Paris during the 1920s, the first surprise is often the way they approach cleanliness. Water, which today feels so ordinary and essential, was seen with suspicion and sometimes even with fear. Many women did not step into a bath filled with warm water as we might picture. Instead, they relied on cloths soaked in perfumed spirits, gently wiping their skin in the belief that this would be enough. This method gave the impression of freshness without the risks they associated with water. It was a habit born of both culture and necessity, repeated in homes across the city without question. The concern with water came from long-standing medical beliefs that it weakened the body. Doctors of the time sometimes warned that baths could open the pores too widely, allowing illness to slip inside. Women repeated these warnings, convinced that avoiding water was a way to protect themselves. For many, the thought of soaking in a tub was unsettling, especially in winter when cold drafts filled even the finest apartments. Cloths dipped in fragrant alcohol became the safer path, wiping away sweat while leaving behind the strong scent of flowers or herbs. There was also the matter of cost. Heating enough water for a full bath was not a simple task. Firewood and coal were expensive, and servants needed hours to carry, heat, and prepare a tub. For poorer families, this was impossible. For the wealthier, it was a luxury not meant for every day. The compromise was the perfumed cloth, quick, practical, and respectable. It allowed women to feel they had cared for their bodies without the burden of a true bath. It almost feels absurd that wiping with alcohol was considered the mark of sophistication, but in those years it truly was. The act itself carried a small ritual. A basin would be set on a table, bottles of scented spirits arranged nearby, and cloths neatly folded. Women dabbed their faces, necks, and arms, avoiding the effort of full immersion. The sting of alcohol on the skin gave a sensation of sharp cleanliness, and the perfume masked the sweat that lingered. Neighbours and visitors who caught a whiff of lavender or rose believed the woman had taken care of herself, never realising how little water had been involved. This practice was also tied to status. True bathing was still seen by many as a medical treatment, something done at spas or on the advice of a doctor. To clean at home with scented spirits was elegant, suggesting refinement and restraint. Water, in contrast, was linked with the working classes, who washed themselves in public fountains or in shared basins after long hours of labour. For Parisian women who wished to appear refined, avoiding water was a statement as much as a habit. There were, of course, hidden costs. Alcohol dried the skin, leaving it irritated and sometimes raw. Without real washing, layers of dirt and sweat built up under clothing, causing discomfort and disease. But because this discomfort appeared slowly, few connected it with their daily routine. The sting of perfume was mistaken for purity, and the faint redness of the skin was dismissed as nothing. It is striking to think that what they called hygiene was, in effect, a cycle of wiping away sweat while trapping bacteria beneath the surface. In crowded Parisian apartments, the smell of perfume often mixed with cooking smoke and coal dust. What might have been intended as a fresh fragrance became another layer in the city's heavy air. Women pressed forward nonetheless, convinced that without these cloths their bodies would betray them with odour or weakness. From the outside, they looked composed and graceful, but beneath the fabric, their skin told a different story. The cultural weight of appearances cannot be ignored. In an era when women's respectability was measured in details of clothing and posture, the act of scented wiping seemed enough. To be seen carrying bottles of rosewater was a mark of refinement. To be known for regular baths might even raise suspicion of illness. The irony is sharp. What we now recognise as unhealthy was in their eyes a symbol of health and status. I cannot help but feel unsettled when imagining these women trusting alcohol more than water, convinced they were guarding themselves from danger while quietly inviting new ones. The belief in perfumed wiping shows how custom can overpower evidence. Generations grew up repeating the same practices without questioning them. If a woman grew sick, it was rarely blamed on her hygiene but rather on fate, weather, or her constitution. This silence allowed the practice to endure, long after other societies had begun to shift toward daily bathing. Inside homes, bottles of perfumed alcohol became as common as soap. They were displayed in cabinets, gifted among friends, and advertised in magazines. The industry thrived, offering endless scents to keep up appearances. It was not water that defined cleanliness in Paris at the time, but fragrance. In a sense, people learned to trust their noses more than their eyes. The reliance on alcohol shaped not only private life, but also public impressions. Visitors to Paris often remarked on the strong perfume that filled salons and theatres. They believed this was a mark of elegance, unaware it was also a mask for the absence of true bathing. What was seen as chic was, at its core, a response to fear, poverty, and misinformation. Reform would not come quickly. The habits of wiping and perfuming were deeply rooted, tied to identity and class. Only with the spread of modern plumbing and changing medical advice did attitudes shift. But in the early decades of the century, to wipe with scented spirits was to be modern, clean, and respectable, no matter what science might one day reveal. The story of perfumed wiping is a reminder of how fragile the meaning of cleanliness can be. It shows how appearances can hide realities, and how even the simplest acts are shaped by culture, class, and fear. The women of Paris in the 1920s believed they were protecting themselves, while in truth they were merely layering fragrance over dirt. They believed wiping with scented spirits was enough to keep bodies fresh, though it left hidden problems beneath the surface. From there, the concern for appearances only deepened, shaping the way they treated even their most precious garments. What those garments concealed would prove just as troubling as the perfumes that masked unwashed skin. Silk and velvet gowns, the prized clothing of Parisian women in the 1920s, were rarely washed in water. The delicate fibres did not tolerate soap or scrubbing, and laundries that specialised in fine garments were expensive. Instead, dresses were hung near open windows, left to air beneath the breeze, or laid out in the sun for hours. This practice did not truly remove dirt or sweat, but it created the impression of freshness. The women who wore these garments believed they were protecting their costly clothes, even as hidden odours slowly grew. Perfume became the answer to what airing could not fix. Bottles of heavy floral scents were kept close at hand, and women discreetly sprayed the fabric under the arms or along the seams. The sharpness of the fragrance masked the sour smell of sweat. To anyone nearby, the sweet perfume defined elegance, covering the truth that the gown had not been properly cleaned in weeks. It is almost comical to imagine a society where spraying perfume under the arm of a dress was considered enough to replace washing. But this was common practice. Powder, too, played its part. Talc was dusted onto the lining of skirts and bodices, soaking up the dampness of skin pressed against layers of fabric. This prevented obvious stains, but created a strange mixture of sweat and powder that clung to the cloth. The combination gave a chalky scent, faint but distinct, mingling with the perfume. From a distance, the gown looked immaculate, shimmering in candlelight or gas lamps. Up close, the illusion began to break. The garments themselves were works of craft. Velvet glowed richly in deep hues, while silk caught the light with every movement. Yet beneath their beauty, they absorbed every trace of the body sweat from dancing, smoke from salons, and the musty air of crowded streets. Without proper washing, these traces accumulated. Women wore them proudly, convinced their careful airing and scenting was enough. The social rules of the time supported this illusion. Cleanliness was judged by how one looked and smelled in public, not by the hidden reality of the fabric. The habit carried risk. Moisture trapped in the cloth encouraged bacteria to grow. Skin pressed daily against the same fibres developed rashes, redness, and irritation. Still, few admitted the connection. If discomfort appeared, it was explained away as sensitivity, not as the result of re-wearing the same unwashed gown. When comparing this with modern habits, it is like imagining someone today wearing the same gym clothes for weeks, covering them only with deodorant spray and talcum powder. The thought feels absurd, yet it once defined elegance. Perfume companies benefited from this pattern. Advertisements promised purity, romance, and charm. Women were told that a single spray could transform them into visions of refinement. These promises played into fears of odour and decay. Buying another bottle of perfume was far easier than finding the means to clean a gown. As industries expanded, shelves filled with new scents, each one claiming to bring freshness. The market thrived on the very avoidance of washing. For many women, the choice was a simple necessity. Wealth might buy multiple gowns, but the middle classes owned only a few. Washing risked destroying them, so the only option was to preserve and disguise. Social events demanded appearances. A woman could not arrive in a stained or faded dress, yet she could not afford constant replacement. Perfume and powder offered a fragile solution. The gown survived. The woman appeared graceful, and the truth was hidden under layers of scent. Inside homes, dresses hung in wardrobes with sachets of lavender or rose petals tucked between folds. These small bags of dried flowers were another attempt to keep odours away. They gave the wardrobe a pleasant smell, though they did little to change the fabric itself. Guests who opened a wardrobe would remark on the fragrance, praising the woman's taste. No one asked when the gowns had last touched water. Respectability rested in appearances, not in the unseen. This practice shaped the culture of cleanliness itself. To rewear an unwashed gown was not considered shameful. It was practical. To protect delicate fabric was even praised as wise. The lingering scents became part of the atmosphere of Parisian salons and theatres. Heavy perfume mixed with smoke and dust, creating a haze that clung to every surface. What should have been freshness became overwhelming, but it was accepted as the sign of refinement. I find it unsettling to think that entire gatherings were filled with people dressed in fabrics that had not been cleaned for weeks, while all believed they were surrounded by elegance. In the end, the dresses told a story of their own. They shone in the evening light, they swayed gracefully as women moved, and they carried with them every secret of sweat and perfume. What was hidden beneath the surface remained unspoken, yet it influenced health and comfort in quiet ways. Only with time and modern cleaning methods would these habits fade. But in the 1920s, the practice was routine, shaping how women presented themselves to society. These dresses looked flawless in the glow of evening lamps, yet beneath the surface they carried layers of sweat and powder. The illusion of refinement held strong, but only as long as no one looked too closely. What women wore under those gowns, however, exposed an even more uncomfortable reality. Woolen stockings clung tightly to the legs of Parisian women in the 1920s, but they were rarely washed. The thick fabric trapped sweat, dust, and odour, holding them far longer than anyone cared to admit. Yet because most families owned only a few pairs, Stockings were worn again and again until they became stiff. Women tried to air them out by hanging them near windows or laying them over chairs, but the smell never truly left. The stockings carried the memory of days of walking through crowded streets, and when pulled on each morning, they pressed those memories back against the skin. Leather shoes presented a different problem. They lacked linings that could absorb sweat, leaving moisture to settle in the dark space within. Hours of wear created a perfect ground for fungus, which spread silently between toes. The smell that drifted from these shoes was sharp and sour, but because shoes were costly, they were worn regardless. A well-polished surface gave the impression of neatness even as the inside bred discomfort. It feels strangely amusing that a woman could shine her shoes until they gleamed while ignoring the festering dampness inside. The matter of undergarments was perhaps the most telling. Silk underwear was expensive, delicate, and difficult to clean. Many women owned only one or two pairs, and some chose to forgo them altogether when at home. This choice was whispered about, rarely spoken aloud, but it was practical. Washing silk risked ruining it, and replacing it was beyond reach for most. Going without became an unspoken solution, a private habit hidden beneath layers of skirts. Together, these items, stockings, shoes, and undergarments formed the invisible side of daily life. They were closest to the body, absorbing its heat and moisture, yet they were also the least cared for. Women dressed themselves each morning in garments that felt clean only on the surface. The scent of perfume on a dress could mask sweat, but stockings still held their odour, and shoes released their own reminders. Respectability was judged from what was seen, not from what was worn in secret. The health effects were plain, though often ignored. Redness appeared on the skin where stockings rubbed. Blisters formed in damp shoes, and irritation spread where silk undergarments went unwashed. These discomforts were accepted as ordinary, part of the burden of being a woman. They did not point fingers at their own habits, but rather blamed the weather, their constitution, or bad luck. When compared to today, it is like imagining people wearing the same pair of socks and shoes for weeks without washing, convinced that a bit of polish or perfume would be enough. The image is unsettling, but it mirrors the reality of the time. Advertisements offered powders and ointments to reduce odour, but they were merely surface solutions. Women sprinkled powders into shoes, rubbed creams onto their feet, and hoped to dull the smell. These small rituals gave them comfort, but they did not solve the problem. In reality, the very items that touched their skin most closely were the least hygienic parts of their lives. Inside homes, stockings often hung by fireplaces, drying stiff after a day's wear. Shoes rested by doors, polished only on the outside. Underwear, if washed at all, was cleaned by hand in basins. The delicate silk stretched and damaged by soap. Many women preferred to save it rather than risk such damage, leaving the fabric unworn for long stretches. The cycle repeated endlessly, creating garments that seemed respectable but carried hidden filth. The silence around these habits is striking. To speak openly about undergarments or foot odour was improper. Women endured the discomfort without complaint, carrying their secrets beneath their gowns. Respectability demanded silence, and silence allowed the practices to persist. Society judged appearances, not hidden realities. The contrast is sharp, elegant gowns swaying through salons above, while beneath them, stockings stiff with sweat and shoes damp with fungus pressed against the skin. It was a contradiction that few acknowledged, yet it defined the lives of countless women. The pursuit of elegance over comfort created a quiet suffering, born privately behind polished surfaces. I find it unsettling to picture the pride women took in presenting themselves so carefully, while knowing the garments hidden beneath were rarely touched by water. This pattern was not only about hygiene, but also about survival. Clothing was costly, and women had to stretch every item as far as possible. Stockings that smelled, shoes that rubbed, undergarments that irritated. These were accepted as the price of respectability. The need to appear refined outweighed the desire for true cleanliness. In the end, the unseen garments shaped the health and comfort of women as much as their visible dresses did. They mark the limits of what poverty, custom, and silence allowed. What was hidden beneath the surface was often more telling than what was displayed, and in this way, the stockings, shoes, and undergarments of Paris became silent symbols of contradiction. Stockings that held odour, shoes that bred fungus, and undergarments rarely washed reveal the hidden cost of respectability. Beneath the polished surface of gowns and perfumes lay discomfort that was carried in silence. Yet the attitudes toward these very flaws would take an unexpected turn, with some even claiming that what others called foulness could be seen as a mark of feminine charm. Among certain groups in Paris during the 1920s, the natural scent of the human body was celebrated in ways that feel unusual today. Artists, writers, and performers in particular treated body odour as something authentic, a signal of vitality and truth. To them, perfume might have been pleasant, but it was also artificial, a mask that hid what they believed was real beauty. The scent of sweat, of skin left untouched by heavy washing, became part of the language of attraction. It was not whispered about with shame, but praised with words that gave it dignity. For many women, this changed how they understood their own bodies and how they chose to present themselves. Letters from the time show this strange fascination. Lovers described each other's odour in detail, recalling the sweetness of sweat after hours of dancing, or the heavy musk after walking through hot city streets. The scent that clung to the body was treated like a treasure, something intimate that perfume could never truly replace. Some women began to believe that their odour was more powerful than any gown or jewel they might wear. They carried themselves with confidence, reassured that what had once been embarrassing could now be seen as alluring. It is almost humorous to think that sweat, usually hidden today, was once praised as if it were fine wine. This belief also shaped daily habits. Many women stopped trying to mask underarm odour. Deodorants and powders existed, but they were harsh on the skin and not widely trusted. Instead of applying alum or talc, women allowed themselves to sweat freely beneath their gowns. They told themselves that men preferred it this way, that natural biology was more appealing than any artificial cover. This practice created a curious blend of practicality and romance, rooted in both convenience and cultural fashion. The artistic world gave these choices credibility. Painters and poets praised the truth of scent, describing sweat as the essence of passion. Plays and novels hinted at lovers who embraced each other without shame, intoxicated by natural smells. What might have been considered vulgar in another age was redefined as authentic. The idea spread slowly from the bohemian circles into more respectable households, carried by gossip, salons, and the growing influence of modern literature. In the busy public spaces of Paris, these ideas took physical form. Theatres, cafes, and dance halls were filled with mingled scents. Perfume was still there, thick and sweet, but it blended with the unmistakable sharpness of sweat. For the wealthy, this was a choice. For the poor, who had little access to perfumes, it was simply life. The new fascination with natural odour gave them a strange kind of equality, where their state was no longer mocked but sometimes praised. Yet the contradiction was obvious. Paris prided itself on refinement and elegance, but refinement now included the acceptance of odours that revealed the absence of real cleanliness. A woman might spend hours dressing in velvet and silk, carefully arranging her hair and applying cosmetics, only to leave her underarms untouched, certain that this was more desirable. When compared to the modern world, it would be like glossy magazines encouraging women to stop using deodorant and embrace body odour as the ultimate sign of beauty. The comparison feels absurd, yet it mirrors the way ideas can shape habits when repeated often enough. Doctors were not silent about the risks. Medical journals noted that bacteria thrived on unwashed skin, and that constant dampness led to irritation and infection. But these warnings struggled against the cultural fascination with authenticity. To many women, the voice of science sounded cold compared to the voice of art. They trusted the poet who described sweat as a mark of passion more than the doctor who called it unhygienic. The result was that odour became less of a medical issue and more of a romantic symbol. Inside homes, this attitude created small but telling rituals. Women no longer rushed to clean themselves after exertion. Instead, they might air out a dress, reapply a little powder, and believe that their natural scent would enhance rather than diminish their charm. Husbands and lovers were expected to notice and appreciate this rawness. In some relationships, the memory of a partner's odour was described as deeply personal, stronger even than the memory of words or gestures. The body itself had become a kind of perfume, but this redefinition of odour carried a hidden cost. Women still suffered from rashes, skin irritation, and discomfort that grew worse when sweat dried into fabric. Without regular washing, bacteria spread more easily. Yet because these ailments were so common, they were seen as normal rather than as preventable problems. Pain was folded into the idea of femininity, treated as another burden that women were expected to carry silently. I find it disturbing to imagine women convincing themselves that what caused them irritation and illness was actually a source of beauty. Encouraged by men who never had to live with the same discomfort, the paradox extended into public culture. Paris was a city of fashion, of beauty, of surfaces polished for display. Yet beneath those surfaces, women were told to embrace what was hidden and unrefined. This contradiction did not strike most people as odd at the time. They accepted that a gown could be immaculate while the body beneath it carried sweat. They accepted that perfume could sit on top of natural odour rather than replace it. The combination defined the atmosphere of salons and theatres, heavy with both floral sweetness and human musk. In the long run, these ideas about odour show how fragile cultural values can be. What one generation condemns, another may praise. What seems obvious in one era is redefined in the next. The women of 1920s Paris lived in a world where sweat was not shameful but seductive, where body odour could be sold as authenticity, and where health was secondary to appearances. The fact that so many accepted this without question reveals how powerful culture can be in shaping even the most intimate details of daily life. Some women found pride in carrying their natural scent as though it were a treasure, convinced it made them more attractive. This strange belief turned neglect into charm, celebrated by artists who gave it legitimacy. Yet behind the glow of powder and perfume, the skin began to suffer, and soon another layer of beauty rituals was needed to hide the growing signs of damage. Cosmetics in Paris during the 1920s were not only about beauty but also about concealment. Faces powdered in thick layers seemed flawless from a distance. Yet the true purpose was often to cover blemishes caused by dust, sweat, and the lack of proper cleansing. The city's streets filled the air with smoke and dirt, and women's skin suffered daily from clogged pores and irritation. Without effective ways to clean their faces, they relied on powder to hide the evidence. The thicker the layer, the more convincing the illusion. Under gaslight or candlelight, these faces appeared smooth and pale, the imperfections buried beneath heavy cosmetics. What made this routine even more harmful was the very composition of the products themselves. Powders and creams contained lead, mercury, and other substances that we now recognize as toxic. Women did not know the risks, or they dismissed them because every magazine praised these items as essentials of modern womanhood. The more they used it, the worse their skin became. A vicious cycle developed. Blemishes grew worse under the chemicals, so more powder was applied to cover them, which in turn deepened the damage. It almost feels ridiculous that what women trusted to create beauty was silently corroding their skin day after day. At night, a few women removed these layers. The idea of a nightly cleansing ritual had not yet taken hold. There were no lotions marketed as skincare, no gentle products designed to heal or repair. Instead, women often went to bed with their faces still painted. The powders rubbed off onto pillows, mixed with sweat, and pressed back into pores. In the morning, another layer was added on top. The cycle of concealment continued without pause. This practice shaped how women saw themselves. To appear without makeup was considered improper, even shameful. A pale, powdered face was a symbol of refinement, a signal that one belonged to the cultured world of Paris. Women believed they could not step outside without it, even within their own homes. Many kept their faces painted in case visitors arrived unexpectedly. Beauty was less about health and more about constant vigilance. The effects were harsh. Redness spread across cheeks, lips cracked under toxic colorants, and foreheads became rough beneath layers of powder. But these were not spoken of openly. Women endured the discomfort quietly, telling themselves it was part of what it meant to be beautiful. When compared to the modern age, it is like imagining people sleeping every night in their full makeup, convinced that washing would do more harm than good. The thought makes clear how different their assumptions were from ours. The industry reinforced these habits. Advertisements promised transformation. Posters declared that powders gave purity, that creams gave vitality, that rouge brought charm. No mention was made of side effects, and few questioned what chemicals lay inside the jars. Shops displayed endless rows of these items, packaged in elegant boxes that suggested safety and luxury. Women bought them eagerly, never suspecting that they were paying for poisons disguised as beauty. Inside homes, dressing tables became small theatres of transformation. Mirrors reflected faces half covered in powder, half bare with blemishes, brushes, jars, and cloth spread across the surface, each tool a step in the daily process of concealment. Husbands and children watched the routine without comment, for it was seen as natural and necessary. The scent of powder filled the air, clinging to curtains and clothing, another reminder that cosmetics were as constant as breath. The wider culture celebrated the illusion. At gatherings, women appeared flawless, their faces glowing under dim light. Compliments flowed freely, reinforcing the belief that the effort was worthwhile. Yet beneath the glow, their skin was suffocating. The contrast between what was seen and what was real became a defining feature of the era's beauty standards. I cannot help but feel uneasy imagining women sleeping night after night with layers of powder grinding into their skin, believing it was elegance when it was decay. Doctors occasionally raised concerns, noting the side effects of heavy metals in cosmetics, but their voices were drowned out by commerce. Women trusted what was fashionable more than what was medical. In a world where appearances were currency, the risks of unseen illness seemed distant. It was easier to believe in the promise of beauty than to confront the cost. Over time, the damage was visible. Wrinkles deepened early, complexions dulled, and skin infections spread silently. But because nearly every woman shared the same habits, these conditions were treated as ordinary signs of age. Few considered that their routines were accelerating the decline. What was marketed as beauty became, in truth, a slow erosion of health. This paradox reflected the broader culture of Paris. The city prided itself on elegance, refinement, and progress, yet its women were quietly poisoning themselves for the sake of appearance. The contradiction was hidden in plain sight, as clear as the powder on their faces. Heavy makeup was not only a symbol of elegance, but also a mask that trapped illness beneath layers of powder. Women believed they were enhancing beauty, while in reality, they were feeding the very problems they tried to hide. And when it came to hair, the same logic of concealment and strange remedies would carry them into even more troubling practices. Hair care in Paris during the 1920s was far from the routine of shampoos and conditioners we know today. Bottled products made for washing hair were still rare and costly, and many women did not even see them as necessary. Instead, they turned to animal fats, applying lard or sheep's tallow directly onto their hair and scalp. These heavy substances gave the impression of moisture and shine, though the effect was greasy and unpleasant by modern standards. What mattered then was that hair seemed smooth and well kept, even if it carried an odour that clung to rooms and clothing. The belief that hair should not be washed often was widespread. Women feared that frequent washing with water would weaken the roots and cause hair to fall out. Instead of cleansing, they layered fat onto strands, convincing themselves that this nourished strength. Advertisements and household advice books reinforced the idea, claiming that natural oils and animal fats were better than soap. In the absence of scientific understanding, women trusted what tradition and hearsay suggested. It almost feels absurd that coating hair with pig fat was seen as a path to beauty. But this was the accepted wisdom of the time. Perfume again became the mask for the less pleasant aspects of this practice. Bottles of rose water or lavender were sprinkled over hair after the fat was applied, creating a mixture that was both floral and rancid. To outsiders, the first whiff was sweetness, but as hours passed, the underlying odour of animal grease surfaced. The combination became so common that it was described as a characteristic Parisian scent. To modern noses it would have been overpowering, but to those accustomed to it, it was simply normal. Inside homes, women spent long moments rubbing the fat into their hair with their fingers, combing it through with wooden combs. These combs themselves grew sticky, their teeth coated with layers of grease and dust. Yet they were rarely washed, for water was considered dangerous to wood and to hair alike. Combs were passed between mothers and daughters, spreading not just grease but also lice and infections. Still, the shine created by the fat was praised, and the discomfort was ignored. The social meaning of hair made this ritual unavoidable. Glossy, heavy hair was seen as a mark of vitality and beauty. Women who allowed their hair to look dry or thin risked whispers about poor health or weakness. The smell of fat and perfume, though unpleasant, was tolerated if it meant a woman appeared strong and desirable. Beauty was measured by sight, not by hygiene, and so the practice endured. Health consequences were significant. Scalp irritation was common, with rashes forming where fat clogged the pores. Dandruff flourished, mixing with grease to create thick flakes. Some women lost hair not from washing too often, but from never cleansing at all. Still, these problems were blamed on personal constitution rather than on habit. Because everyone around them followed the same practices, few recognized the harm for what it was. When compared to today, it is like imagining people deliberately pouring cooking grease on their heads each week, covering the smell with perfume, and believing this made them more attractive. The thought feels bizarre, but it mirrors the logic of that era. The industry that sold perfumes and scented waters benefited again. They marketed their products as solutions for hair odour, encouraging women to pour more fragrance over greasy locks. This created another cycle. More fat meant more smell, which meant more perfume, which then mixed with the fat to create even heavier odours. Shops thrived, and women kept buying, convinced they were keeping up with the latest standards of elegance. Daily life reflected this constant mixture. In salons, the scent of perfume and grease filled the air, mingling with smoke and dust. Women adjusted their hair with combs that shone with fat, confident that their glossy appearance was admired. Men praised the weight of their hair, the way it caught the light, never speaking of the odour that came with it. To question the practice would have been to question the very definition of beauty at the time. Inside private rooms, jars of fat were kept alongside bottles of perfume on dressing tables. Servants prepared the mixtures, sometimes heating the fat to make it easier to spread. The warm smell filled the air as women sat before mirrors, rubbing the substance into their hair. Curtains, cushions, and linens absorbed the scent, turning entire homes into silent reminders of this ritual. Guests may have noticed but said nothing, for politeness demanded silence on such matters. Over time, some reformers began to speak of soap and water as healthier for hair. Small articles appeared in medical journals, suggesting that cleansing could strengthen rather than weaken roots. But change was slow. Habits passed down through generations were difficult to break, and the fear of hair loss remained stronger than trust in new science. Only decades later, with the mass production of shampoo, would these practices fade? For women in the 1920s, however, lard and tallow remained the standard. They accepted the greasiness, the odour, and the irritation because beauty was not judged by comfort but by appearance. The paradox was clear in seeking to make their hair strong. They weakened it in seeking to smell appealing. They layered scents that turned repellent. The routine of spreading animal fat into hair, then covering it with perfume, created an illusion of strength while quietly damaging scalp and strands. It was a ritual carried out with pride, though its results were far from healthy. Yet these grooming habits extended beyond hair, for even tools of personal care like combs, cloths, and razors were shared freely, bringing another hidden world of risk. Combs, towels, and razors were not seen as private items in Paris during the 1920s. Instead, they were shared openly within families and even among friends. A single wooden comb might pass from mother to daughter, then to visiting relatives, and finally back again without anyone questioning whether this was unclean. The comb's teeth carried strands of hair, flakes of dandruff, and traces of grease from animal fat, yet it was treated as a simple household tool. Water was rarely used to clean it, since the fear of swelling or damaging the wood kept people from washing it properly. What should have been an intimate object became communal, and with it came invisible risks that few understood. Face towels followed the same pattern. Women hung them on balconies or near windows, letting the air and sunlight pass through them. To most households, this was more than enough to count as cleaning. The towel, stiff with powder, sweat, and oils, was used repeatedly until its fabric carried a permanent scent. Still, it was handed around without hesitation, pressed against faces and necks, spreading whatever germs it carried from one person to the next. It is strangely amusing to think that a towel stiff with days of use could be called fresh simply because it had hung in the breeze. Razors, though, brought the greatest danger. Women shaved their underarms and legs with the same blades that others had used before them. The metal scraped against skin, leaving tiny cuts that were easily overlooked. These cuts became pathways for infection, especially since blades were rarely disinfected. In some households, razors moved between sisters, mothers, and even neighbours, treated as though they were no more personal than a kitchen knife. The pain and redness that followed were accepted as ordinary consequences rather than warnings. The logic behind this sharing was both cultural and practical. Personal care items were expensive, and many families could not afford to buy separate ones for each person. At the same time, there was little understanding of how disease spread. Bacteria were invisible, and without a clear link between sharing tools and falling ill, people saw no reason to change their habits. In their eyes, thrift and cooperation were virtues, while concerns about hygiene seemed unnecessary. In beauty routines, these shared objects played a central role. Women brushed their hair with combs already coated in oils, then dabbed their faces with towels that had dried on balconies. They shaved with blades dulled from repeated use, believing they were maintaining elegance while quietly risking infection. To them, this was care. To us, it is neglect. When compared to modern habits, it is like imagining entire households using the same toothbrush and seeing nothing wrong with it. The comparison highlights how differently people understood hygiene at the time. The results were visible in everyday life. Skin infections appeared on faces, rashes developed on legs, and dandruff spread through families. Yet these conditions were normalized. A red patch of skin was dismissed as sensitivity, an infected cut as bad luck. Few thought to connect them to the tools they shared. Because so many people suffered similar problems, the discomfort became part of ordinary existence. Shops that sold combs and razors thrived on this culture. They marketed their goods as durable and long-lasting, encouraging buyers to see them as family investments rather than personal items. A single comb was said to serve for years, passed from one user to another. The idea of disposable or personal care products had not yet taken hold, and so the cycle of sharing continued. Inside homes, these objects carried their own presence. A comb left on a dressing table, a towel hanging stiff on a balcony rail, a razor resting by a mirror, all of them were symbols of daily life, but they also held traces of every person who touched them. Women did not see this as troubling. Instead, they saw it as practical, even intimate, linking themselves to family members through the tools of care. Cultural silence played a part as well. To question these habits was to suggest that family members might make each other sick, an idea that felt both impolite and frightening. So the sharing was never criticized, only accepted. In this way, invisible dangers moved quietly through households, disguised as ordinary kindness. I find it unsettling to imagine a family passing around the same razor, each person leaving behind tiny wounds, all convinced they were simply being practical. The persistence of these practices reminds us how much of hygiene is shaped by custom rather than knowledge. The people of Paris valued thrift, cooperation, and appearances, and they trusted air, sunlight, and perfume to keep things safe. The reality beneath those beliefs was far harsher. Shared combs, towels, and razors created a cycle of unseen infections disguised as ordinary thrift. Women accepted irritation and illness as natural parts of life, never questioning their cause. Yet the problems that spread quietly through households were only the beginning, for skin conditions and fungal infections soon became so widespread that they were treated as if they were simply part of being a woman. Skin conditions were a constant companion for women in Paris during the 1920s, so common that they became an almost invisible part of daily life. Redness, itching, and sores were treated as ordinary discomforts, barely worth mentioning to doctors. The combination of rarely washed clothing, shared grooming tools, and layers of makeup left its mark on nearly every body. Yet instead of being recognized as signs of neglect or infection, these ailments were simply absorbed into the idea of what it meant to be a woman. They were endured quietly, brushed aside as natural, even when they caused lasting harm. Stockings stiff with sweat and dust were one of the main culprits. Wool clung tightly to the legs, trapping heat and moisture until rashes formed. The skin beneath grew raw, sometimes splitting open into painful sores. Still, women pulled the same stockings back on the next day, convinced that discomfort was part of refinement. A small itch or wound was given no weight, no matter how persistent. In the language of the time, these problems were described as little inconveniences, not illnesses. It feels absurd that women accepted bleeding sores from their stockings as just another detail of fashion. But that was the thinking of the era. Shoes deepened the problem. Leather without linings offered no protection against dampness. Fungal infections spread across toes and nails, slowly eating away at skin and keratin. Women endured cracked heels, burning sensations, and nails that thickened unnaturally. Rather than seeing these conditions as infections, they spoke of them as nuisances, the price of elegance. To be fashionable meant enduring pain, and so the infections spread unchallenged from woman to woman, from home to home. The most striking part was the way society labelled these problems. Sores and fungal growths were often called women's complaints, as though they were inevitable byproducts of femininity. Instead of treating them as medical concerns, people treated them as quirks of the female body. The normalization of discomfort silenced women from speaking up. They learned to accept the itch, the sting, and the sight of reddened skin as unavoidable companions. This silence allowed the conditions to flourish without remedy. Pharmacies took advantage of the situation. In Paris, druggists sold ointments freely, no prescription required. These creams often contained harsh chemicals such as phenol, carbolic acid, or mercury compounds. They burned the skin, providing a temporary sense of relief, but they did not cure the underlying problem. In many cases, they worsened the irritation, yet women continued to buy them, desperate for any sign of comfort. Advertisements promised purity and strength, but what they delivered was another layer of harm. When compared to modern life, it would be like pharmacies offering bleach-based lotions for everyday rashes and people using them without hesitation. The image makes clear how little protection consumers had. In households, the signs of these conditions were everywhere. Women sat with their stockings rolled down, scratching at their calves. Red marks bloomed on ankles where sweat had gathered. Fingers rubbed at nails warped by fungus, trying to smooth them with files. Pillows carried traces of powders and creams rubbed on before sleep, staining the fabric with chemical smells. Family members often shared the same afflictions, since they also shared clothing, towels, and grooming tools. Illness moved invisibly through households, masked as routine. Despite the discomfort, the cultural silence was strong. To complain about rashes or sores was to risk being seen as weak or unrefined. Instead, women kept their suffering private. In letters and diaries, traces of this silence can be seen. Mentions of burning feet, itching skin, or unhealed sores appear only briefly, tucked between descriptions of daily chores. The reluctance to name these conditions as serious problems allowed them to persist for years. I find it unsettling to imagine how many women endured raw, cracked skin each day, treating it as ordinary while it quietly worsened. Doctors, when consulted, often dismissed these complaints as minor. They offered general advice about changing stockings more often or applying ointments, without questioning the deeper causes. Since most women lived in crowded apartments with little money for clothing, these solutions were impossible. The gap between medical advice and lived reality meant that the suffering continued unchecked. The wider culture of Paris helped normalize this acceptance. In theatres, ballrooms, and salons, women appeared in their finery, but beneath the gowns their legs burned with irritation and their nails ached. Yet no one spoke of it. Beauty was measured by the surface, not by the health hidden below. In this way, elegance and decay coexisted without conflict. Over time, these untreated conditions had lasting consequences. Fungus deformed nails permanently, infections spread from small cuts, and scars formed on skin that had never been allowed to heal. Some women carried these marks throughout their lives, visible reminders of habits they never questioned. What could have been treated with proper hygiene became permanent damage, but by then, it was too late. The paradox of the time is clear. Paris styled itself as the heart of culture, beauty, and refinement. Yet beneath its surface lay countless women suffering from preventable ailments. They powdered their faces, perfumed their dresses, and polished their shoes, but their skin told another story. It was the story of a society more concerned with appearances than with health, more willing to accept pain than to change habits. These conditions, so widespread and so normalized, reveal the fragility of cultural standards. What should have been alarming was accepted. What should have been questioned was silenced. The women of Paris bore the cost, their bodies carrying the quiet scars of a culture that mistook endurance for elegance. Rashes, sores, and fungal infections spread silently, treated not as illness but as ordinary burdens of femininity. Women endured them quietly, masked them with ointments, and never spoke of the deeper causes. Yet the same culture that normalized these conditions also filled the mouth with decay. For dental care was just as neglected and left behind its own trail of suffering. Dental care in Paris during the 1920s was a world away from what we think of as routine today. Toothbrushes were not found in every home, and toothpaste was still considered a new invention, often priced beyond the reach of ordinary families. Instead, most people relied on simple and abrasive methods to clean their teeth, if they attempted cleaning at all. A handful of salt rubbed directly onto enamel, or a pinch of powdered charcoal smeared across gums counted as effort. These practices gave a temporary feeling of rough cleanliness, but they damaged teeth over time, wearing away enamel and leaving mouths vulnerable to decay. For many women, this was the extent of dental hygiene, a ritual performed occasionally, never daily. The rarity of true brushing left its mark on public life. Breath heavy with odour was not considered unusual, but part of the atmosphere of gatherings, cafes, and theatres. People accepted it as they accepted smoke, sweat, and perfume. The expectation that everyone's breath should be fresh simply did not exist. A woman might perfume her dress and powder her face, yet when she leaned close to speak, the scent of neglect drifted out unnoticed. No one found it shocking, for it was common to all. It is almost funny to imagine that in a city obsessed with appearances, a mouthful of foul breath could still pass as respectable. Charcoal was among the most common tools for those who did attempt some kind of cleaning. Black dust stained fingers and lips, leaving traces across cloths and basins. It scratched at teeth, scraping away food but also enamel. The harshness caused sensitivity, but people took this as a sign of effectiveness. The same was true of salt, which left gums raw and bleeding. Instead of seeing this as harm, women believed the sting meant that their teeth were being purified. Pain was treated as proof of success. Toothpaste, by contrast, was a luxury. Advertisements showed shining white smiles, promising health and beauty through modern science. But the price was high, and only the wealthy could indulge in such items regularly. For middle and lower class women, these products were glimpses of another world, admired from the distance of shop windows. Inside their own homes, they continued to grind salt into their gums or skipped cleaning altogether. The gap between what was possible and what was practiced remained wide. Dentistry as a profession was still viewed with hesitation. Few women visited dentists unless pain forced them to. Treatment was costly and often brutal, involving extractions without proper anaesthesia. Preventive care was nearly unheard of. Most mouths were full of cavities, infections, and missing teeth. But because this was so widespread, it was normalised. To smile with gaps or to cover the mouth while laughing was ordinary, not shameful. In this silence, poor dental health flourished. The meals themselves worsened the problem. Bread, often coarse and full of grit from mills, wore at teeth like sandpaper. Sweets, cheaply made with adulterated ingredients, clung to gums and rotted enamel. Without proper cleaning, decay sets in quickly. Women accepted toothache as part of life, something to be endured like headaches or fatigue. When compared to modern standards, it is like imagining entire neighbourhoods where no one brushes their teeth daily, and dental visits happen only when extraction is the only option. The thought reveals how neglected oral health truly was. Inside homes, the signs were visible. Cups of blackened salt stood on shelves, sometimes used, sometimes ignored. Charcoal left smears across basins. Children grew up without daily rituals of brushing, learning instead that teeth required attention only when pain arrived. Families passed down these habits from mother to daughter, convinced that nothing more was necessary. The smell of neglect became part of domestic life, as ordinary as the scent of cooking or coal smoke. The social consequences were surprisingly minimal. In crowded gatherings, everyone shared the same conditions, so no one stood apart. A foul breath was masked by perfume, a decayed tooth hidden by closed lips. Women worried more about their dresses and faces than about their mouths, for society judged them on visible beauty. Teeth could be concealed, and so they were neglected. This hierarchy of appearance ensured that oral health stayed at the bottom of priorities. Pharmacies played their part, offering powders that promised fresh breath for special occasions. Mouth rinses scented with herbs or alcohol were purchased only for banquets or balls. These products were not intended for daily use but for display, a quick fix before stepping into the public eye. The rest of the week, mouths returned to neglect. In this way, freshness became a performance rather than a practice. The cost of this neglect was borne silently. Infections spread from the gums into the blood, causing illness that no one traced back to the mouth. Women suffered headaches and fevers from abscesses. yet doctors rarely connected the symptoms to dental decay. The medical knowledge was limited, and the cultural silence surrounding oral care meant that causes went unnamed. Pain was endured until a tooth was finally pulled, often at home, often without proper tools. What is striking is how deeply this neglect was accepted. To have a mouthful of rot was not a mark of shame, but a fact of life. Women wore fine gowns and painted their faces, but behind their smiles lay decay. The contradiction is stark. A culture obsessed with refinement allowed one of the most basic aspects of health to crumble without protest. I cannot help but feel disturbed at the thought of women walking proudly into salons with powdered faces while hiding mouths that ached with untreated infections. The story of dental neglect in Paris during the 1920s shows how cultural priorities can distort health. Appearances ruled, and since teeth could be hidden, they were ignored. Without education, affordable products, or social pressure to change, women accepted decay as natural. The result was a city filled with beauty on the surface and sickness beneath. Oral hygiene was almost non-existent, leaving mouths full of decay hidden behind painted faces. Perfume and powder masked what breath revealed, turning neglect into something invisible. Yet the same silence that surrounded mouths extended to intimate matters of the body, where even more uncomfortable routines left women vulnerable in ways they dared not speak aloud. Menstrual care in Paris during the 1920s reveals another hidden corner of daily life, one shaped by silence, modesty, and practices that today feel deeply unsafe. Disposable pads did not yet exist, and tampons had not entered the market for ordinary women. Instead, cloth was the only option. Pieces of linen or cotton were folded into layers and fastened awkwardly inside undergarments. These strips were reused again and again, washed by hand when possible, and dried discreetly away from view. The routine was exhausting, uncomfortable, and often harmful, yet it was accepted as natural. Women endured in silence, bound by both necessity and shame. The cloth itself was rarely new. Old garments, bed linens, or scraps of household fabric were repurposed into pads. The softness of well-worn cloth made them tolerable, but the fibres were never entirely clean, carrying with them stains and residue from earlier use. Once soiled, they had to be rinsed and scrubbed, often in cold water since heating water required extra coal or wood. Soap was used sparingly, as scented bars were costly. Even when cleaned, the cloth never regained a sense of freshness. Women folded it again, resigned to its imperfection, and continued the cycle. It almost feels absurd that what was seen as proper care involved pressing stained rags back against the body. But this was the accepted standard of the time. Drying the clothes presented another challenge. To hang them openly in sunlight, where heat might sterilize them, was considered indecent. Modesty demanded that menstrual cloth be hidden from sight. As a result, they were often dried in shaded corners, behind curtains, or indoors where air circulated poorly. Dampness lingered in the fibres, creating the perfect environment for bacteria. Women then refolded and reused them, unaware that the very cloth meant to protect them was also introducing infection. The social silence around menstruation deepened these risks. Mothers rarely spoke to daughters about what to expect or how to manage it. When a girl had her first period, she was often handed a cloth without explanation. Trial and error became her education. Mistakes were inevitable: cloth too loose, leaks staining dresses, or infections caused by poorly washed fabric. Yet shame kept these matters private. Women carried their struggles quietly, never speaking of them in public and rarely even among friends. The physical consequences were severe. Rashes spread across the thighs where a damp cloth rubbed. Infections took hold in the genital area, causing swelling, pain, and fever. Many women lived with constant irritation, considering it unavoidable. Doctors occasionally saw patients suffering from abscesses or chronic inflammation, but they seldom connected these problems to menstrual care. Instead, they blamed weak constitutions, poor diet, or vague notions of feminine fragility. The true causes remained hidden beneath silence and habit. In pharmacies, powders and ointments were sold to ease discomfort, but they offered no real protection. Some women sprinkled talc onto the cloth, believing it would absorb moisture and reduce odour. Others used perfumes to mask the smell, a practice that caused more irritation. These additions layer chemicals onto already unclean fabric, increasing the likelihood of infection. The pursuit of modesty and fragrance only deepened the harm. When compared to modern products, it is like imagining women today cutting up old shirts, rinsing them quickly, hiding them indoors to dry, and then wearing them again each month. The comparison makes clear how precarious their situation was. Inside homes, the rhythm of this routine-shaped daily life. Wash basins carried the burden of soaking cloth after use. Buckets of water stained pink or brown were emptied discreetly into drains or alleys. Women timed their washing to avoid notice, scrubbing quickly and wringing the cloth before tucking it away to dry. Curtains fluttered slightly with the hidden weight of damp fabric hanging behind them. The secrecy transformed an ordinary function of life into something shadowed and silent, treated almost as a personal failure rather than a natural process. The silence was reinforced by etiquette. To speak of menstruation in polite society was unthinkable. Even within families, words were avoided. Euphemisms replaced direct language, and gestures replaced explanations. This left women isolated, each believing her difficulties were hers alone. The lack of open conversation ensured that harmful practices went unchallenged. What might have been solved with shared knowledge became generations of repeated mistakes. The strain of managing menstruation with limited resources also shaped how women moved through the world. On heavy days, some avoided social gatherings entirely, fearful of stains or odours. Others layered skirts or carried shawls to disguise accidents. The fear of exposure weighed heavily, adding anxiety to discomfort. In this way, menstruation was not only a physical burden but also a social one, restricting women's freedom and confidence. For poorer families, the burden was greater still. Cloth was scarce, and some women had only 1 or 2 rags to rotate. When these were in use, they had no replacements, forcing them to sit still or remain at home until the cloth could be washed and dried. The lack of resources turned menstruation into days of isolation, cutting women off from work, markets, or visits. The economic consequences were real, though rarely acknowledged. In wealthier households, servants sometimes managed the washing, but this added another layer of silence and shame. Women hid clothes from male servants, whispering instructions to female staff. The rags were washed quickly, discreetly, and returned without comment. Even here, where resources were greater, the secrecy remained absolute. The paradox of Parisian refinement is stark. The same city that draped women in velvet and silk left them to manage menstruation with rags hidden in shadows. Appearances were polished in salons and theatres, yet behind the scenes, women endured infection and discomfort without recognition. I cannot help but feel unsettled at the thought of countless women moving through elegant ballrooms, while beneath their gowns they wore damp cloths that had been washed in secrecy and dried away from the cleansing light of the sun. This hidden struggle reveals much about the culture of the time. It shows how silence can turn ordinary needs into sources of suffering. It shows how modesty, when taken to extremes, becomes harmful, and it shows how poverty and neglect combine to make life more painful than it has to be. The women of Paris bore this burden quietly, their suffering hidden beneath layers of fabric, their voices silenced by custom. Reusable cloth pads washed by hand and dried in secret became both a necessity and a danger, leaving countless women vulnerable to infection. What was hidden away from sight carried risks that no one dared to name. From this silence surrounding menstrual care, attention shifts to the public sphere, where even something as simple as relieving oneself in the city became another ordeal for women. Public restrooms for women in Paris during the 1920s were almost non-existent. The city, proud of its boulevards and cafes, had invested in urinals and public conveniences for men, but women were left to manage on their own. To relieve themselves outside the privacy of the home, they had to navigate a patchwork of makeshift solutions. Many entered cafes not for coffee, but simply to gain access to the facilities. Others relied on the generosity of strangers, asking to use the lavatories of private homes. For those without money or connections, there were often no options at all. The absence of spaces designed for women turned an ordinary need into a daily ordeal. Clothing complicated matters further. The long skirts and multiple layers worn by women made privacy difficult to maintain in public. Unlike men, who could quickly use the urinals scattered across the city, women needed enclosed spaces, and these were rarely provided. A few, determined to avoid embarrassment, carried portable chamber pots. These small vessels were hidden beneath wide skirts,